Hello, I am here today to talk about building the gaps in your story, which may seem counterintuitive, but whatever. It also has the other title of Sherlocking it up because I want to, jazz it up a little bit, and then Sherlock seemed like the best idea. I don't like Sherlock that much. So, this here, if you can see it properly, is a gap. That's a gap. That's not the kind of gap I'm talking about today, but this is the only relevant photo I could find. Yeah, go for it. This is the only relevant photo I could find on my entire computer to use as a picture. And then I realized that I shouldn't use photos, and I should just do this. So, I'm here to talk to you about info gaps, which are a beautiful, powerful, terrifying, and invisible storytelling tool. Invisible because, they're literally gaps. I'm here to teach you to build with gaps. So many words involving gaps. Oh, I forgot to do this. Hang on. There we go. Okay. I can't read my own slides. It's a problem. How do I make it go next? Oh. Who? Who am I? That's a gap. Unless you know me, then it's not. So, to begin with, if you hear my accent and my slang, you'll realize that I am Kiwi American. If you look in my room, see my desk, I messed that up. If you look in my room, you'll see my desk piled with the well-used notebooks, tabbed with post-it notes. Beside them is a bookmarked copy of The Writer's Guide to Dialogue. I'm a writer. Look around a little more, and you'd find crutches in a corner and a resistance band hanging from my shelf. You might glean, I'm going through physical therapy right now. If you look closer at the crutches, you'll see that they have a tag saying they're from a hospital in a different city to where I live. If you watch me limp, what does this tell you? I hurt my leg in a city I don't live in. Say I'm wearing my jeans, they have a hole over my left knee. You'll see my massive scar. You know that I recently had serious surgery on my knee. And then I'm here from New Zealand giving a talk to you all, so I probably know my shit, right? These are all things that you can infer from information. You can search out yourself, right? I mean, don't go into my room for no reason, but if you wander through my room, say like my room's a game environment and you wandered through and found those things, you would learn a little bit about my backstory as a person. And like, the knee is the most exciting story I have right now, and I have a lot of stuff in my room about my knee, so that was the easiest thing for me to go with. But there's plenty of information you can glean about people just from looking at the way they dress, the way they talk, all that stuff. And that is information you can put into your games. And that is information that is filling gaps, but also has massive gaps between it, right? Like, in the grand scheme of my life, I feel like I wrote this on the slide. I did. There are big gaps of information in the grand scheme of my life, right? Like, these are just very spaced out things. You don't get a huge picture of who I am as a person entirely, but you get an idea of it, and that's what's important. So what's missing in these gaps? Well, for one thing, I have professional knowledge, which is why I'm here. I'm a narrative designer, editor, and writer. I also podcast. I think that might be my next thing. Nope, I'm an award-winning writer. That's a thing now, so I have some credence to me. I worked on Love Is Dead, If Not Us, Intimacy, and Like You Mean It. Like You Mean It is a jam game, but I really like it, so I like mentioning it. Love Is Dead is a puzzle game about zombies in love who are trying to save their pets, who are also zombies. If Not Us, that's fine. If Not Us is an interactive fiction anthology that I edited, done by the amazing Rukia Patel. It's very good, and also a very good example of storytelling gaps used very well. Intimacy is a card game about intimacy with people, not necessarily like sexual, but just intimacy with people, that I also edited. So I like editing, obviously. I also wrote for the Dates 2 anthology, which is a comics anthology. That was the award-winning thing. I am working on an audio drama called Dr. Seabrook, which you should look up because it's going to be amazing. I don't know if it's actually been announced yet, and I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it yet, but I did anyways because I'm excited about it. It's made by the same people as the Love and Luck podcast, so you should look that up if you like happy, wholesome stuff. And I also wrote Mountain Sound, which was a serial I did, an ongoing serial at the time, now it is finished, that I am still proud of and like a lot. I also podcast. I am a network director of a podcast network that is currently on hiatus. And I'm also a big nerd. I love Star Wars. I love lots of things. Halo and Star Wars and whatever. I'm a big, big nerd. And yeah, I know my shit. I do genuinely know my shit. I pretend I don't. I act kind of ditzy and whatever because it's easier to get through life if people don't ask me serious questions. But I genuinely know quite a lot about writing and design. So, info gaps. What actually are info gaps? It's probably a good question. They are gaps of no knowledge between given information. They are hard to pin down because they are an absence of information. We unconsciously not that yet. We unconsciously build stories with given pieces of information, right? That's a thing that we just do. We can't really help it. But the faster a player can put together these pieces without thought, so automatically, the easier it will be to settle into the story/game. That's how it works. This is why writing shortcuts and tropes exist, right? Because they are easy ways for players and readers and your audience in general to like click onto things happening, right? So if you've got like a girl dressed in pink and she's got blonde hair, it's a dumb stereotype. But if you've got that, people gather an idea of that because of like our collective knowledge, which is filled gaps already. The gaps that are filled within our brain. Whereas if you like have a completely different looking character, you're gonna have to fill a lot more gaps for your players to begin with. Like if your color scheme's whack and weird, and it's like a new character design that people aren't used to, you're gonna have to put more work in to begin with. Not that that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that that's a thing you need to consider. But yeah, first up, let's talk about situation models. I just realized that my talk thing is slightly off from yours, sorry about that. Situation models, which is a psychology thing, I think. I hope there's no psych people in here to judge me, please don't judge me. So, worlds in our brains, right? I'm stealing this term from psych. There we go. A mental representation of a story and its world, built from general knowledge and specific knowledge. So general knowledge is what we know about the world, like water is wet. That's just stuff we know. Specific knowledge is what the story tells us. So like the Jedi use the Force, but normal people don't. That's information we get from the story. And so we build these models of the world. Yes. So we reference this model that we've built of these stories when we interact with the story. A player builds, revises, and references this model for textual coherency and interpretation. Textual coherency being a holistic understanding of the game story, right? So when you play a game, you build this model. When you read a book, you build this model. It's a thing that you just do. And we don't even think about it consciously, but it's important to remember when you're actually building a game and a story for people to understand. Obviously, when you're writing or creating a story yourself, your mental model will be a lot more thought out and a lot more solid for you than it will be for anybody who's playing your game. And that's something you always need to remember. What's next? That's next. Okay, so players use these models for story inference. So, you know, Vader is evil, Kid Anakin is good, so we know something bad happened to Anakin, right? That's just a thing we can infer from those two bits of information. Inference is, well, when we infer details, obviously, from the information given by a story. Why is this so hard to read? Large info gaps give us less to build a situation model, obviously, but it gives you more ambiguity in a story, and that can be very useful. And we'll talk about ambiguity a little more later, but not right now. So we've got bits and gaps. And so, like, information bits are, you know, little bits of information. They're the bits that you build the story with. This is a term I made up, I think, so like don't look up this anywhere except for right now. And then information gaps are the opposite. They're the gaps between this information. And so those can change, vary in size, vary in the word for lots of them being there, whatever that word is. Apparently I just forget words sometimes. There's a gap. Yes, games, unlike film and literature, have a much vaster range of information delivery. So we're not confined to just one medium. Like, so if you've got a book, literature has inherent gaps in the lack of visuals, right? You can't actually see the world happening. You can create your mind's eye world. If you have a mind's eye, you can create a world within your brain that you see, but you're creating this from the gaps that are there. Comics and graphic novels rely on readers inferring movement between panels, and film gives us audio and visual and movement, but it doesn't give us continuous, right? There are gaps. Every time a scene cuts between things, that's gaps. It's like the shot that has one thing and another thing, and you connect the two things. I forgot what it's called. Volashov? Does anyone know what this is called? Any film people in here? What was it? Kuleshov effect. That's it. Look that up. Yeah, it's when you have two cuts of like different things, and then you see them side by, like you watch one, then the other one happens, and you infer something from that. So film does have gaps, and we do use inference a lot with film. Theatre, on the other hand, gives us continuous visual and oral action, right? So if you go to a play, there's no way to cut it. The only way that there are gaps is like when they change the lighting and stuff like that, and there's a lot of interesting uses in there. But theatre gives us the least gaps, really, of any of these mediums, just because it's a real interactive thing. Well, not necessarily interactive all the time, but it's a real thing we see. And then in games, that is also continuous, unless the game is designed to not be like that. So if you play Virginia, that game is filled with gaps. So many gaps, because it's got film cuts and stuff like that. But games can be all text, they can be all visual, they can be all audio, they could use all three of those things, they may use none of those things. It really just depends on the game. And because games can be so versatile and is such a vast medium and is also interactive, we have much more like ability to mess with how we use our gaps. Like I say on the slide, games can pick and choose from each of these mediums. There are no inherent gaps in game design, right? Nothing inherent. So, let's compare some things. There are no inherent things? Consider Inside versus Dragon Age Origins, right? Inside has no dialogue or writing. It's fully linear. There's dialogue and writing. There's writing in the menu. That's the only time you see writing. It's got a very ambiguous story and ending, but you still get a very clear idea of what the story and the ending are. Like, you get a very strong sense of story from that game and the environment and the world from that game, even though it's filled with gaps. Dragon Age Origins, on the other hand, has so much reading, so much choice. There's very little ambiguity in the story, right? Even though we can make choices that differ, the story itself is not very ambiguous. We pretty much get the whole point of the story. And then you've got, these are different uses of gaps already. And then you've got Skyrim, an exploration game. It's high emphasis on environmental storytelling and RPG gameplay. Low emphasis on text, despite the massive lore dumps, right? Like, the text you get from the people you're talking to is not a huge emphasis within the game. The game is very much about the environmental storytelling and your effect on the world. And then you've got In the Snowy Winter's Wake, which is a very cool game. It's an exploration game. It's a game that's basically like a first-person exploration game, but it's all in text. And so you kind of have to look at it to understand it, but like the color changes and stuff like that depending on what's happening. It's really cool. So it's like first-person, but all text. You need to look at it. Anyways, and it's also an exploration game. There's a high emphasis on the described environment, but it has massive gaps in the actual visual info bits, right? Apart from the color and the way the text is formatted, you don't get any info on like how the world actually looks, unlike Skyrim, which is highly detailed. And that affects how you infer the story and how you retain information about that story. Wait, do I have a thing that I need to say? Yeah, interactive play spaces with no set design rules give us, as designers, a near unlimited toolbox of info gaps and bits, and that is extremely exciting. So, also, just look at her story. It's just amazing. It's so good. It's exactly what I'm talking about here. Everything about her story is just so good. It's a perfect example. You start the game with only the keywords, so if you don't know anything about her story, it's basically you're searching through a police database of videos related to this one woman. And the game starts off with you get the keyword already of murder, and then it's just this woman talking. And from there, you get like massive information gaps. You don't know what's happening, but you can already infer so much just from that, right? The game is perfect. I love that game. Anyways, gaps are essential for the mystery genre in particular. Carefully crafted gaps and information are what drive the tension and increase mystery and speculation when solving a mystery. Deduction is an essential part of mystery fiction, and well-placed gaps are essential for this. I keep saying essential, it's because it's essential. If you don't have a big part of crime writing is figuring out what the solution is and then working backwards, right? So you work backwards, figuring out where the hints need to be and everything. You need to think about where the gaps will be and where the player is going to be thinking, what the player is going to be thinking because of those gaps. So like if you purposefully leave, like obfuscate, that's a word, something from the player, you need to think about why you're doing that. And that's a gap for them. It's not one for you, obviously, but it is for them. And that will lead them to inferring certain information that may be different to what you want, or maybe exactly what you want. So, does that actually make sense to people? Please nod if it does. Okay, it's a lot of nodding. Good. I will have questions later if you need to ask. Okay, cool. That was the easy stuff. Now we're going to actually dive into it a bit more. Shoebox. This was a project. Is there anybody from Dino Polo Club in here? Oh, I'm safe. Okay, good. I actually have permission to talk about this. It's fine. Shoebox is a prototype I worked on last year and some of this year, which basically had minimalist storytelling. I had, the brief, the very basic brief when I started working on the prototype. For the record, I'm talking about a very early prototype of a game that's been kind of tucked away, so like this won't ever come out. Like you won't ever see this in an actual game probably, which is why I can talk about it right now. So I had to design an information sorting, that's the word. Why am I not just reading it like this? I designed an information sorting puzzle without just using a single box of minimal assets that when solved would create an emotionally resonant story arc. So basically, I had 12 items to work with. I could design whatever they were. And they had to both be a puzzle that you had to solve through sorting information and deduction, and also tell an emotionally resonant story. And if that doesn't sound hard to you, it's because you've never tried to do that. So knowing what info gaps would help or hinder story or puzzle progression was essential. Once again, essential. It was essential for this design. This is when I started researching gaps and actually doing a lot of design work on this, is because I needed to understand for this thing. So I've been wanting to do this talk for a while because of that. And so at the time it was just one arc, but also this arc at the time of discussing this prototype would have led into another related arc about a different character. And so there had to be gaps in this first box that would lead the player towards that as well. So I had to design those gaps too. So where to begin with that? Well, you need the info essential to the story. Are my pictures in the next slide? Yes, okay. So you need info that's essential to the story, obviously. So these are the things you need to be writing down, like the things you need to remember to have. So you need the info essential to the story, the info essential to the puzzle, also important. They can both be the same thing, but you need to make sure you have both of those things. You need, what do you want your players to infer at any given point of the game? What do you want your players to be thinking and guessing at? What do you want players to miss? What are the things you don't want players to notice? Because you need to also think about those. Interesting versus essential info. So basically, the interesting info are the things that the players care about and want to learn more about. That may not be the puzzle stuff necessarily. At the time, the puzzle information was somewhat different. The story kind of had to work around the puzzle info because the puzzle info didn't actually tell a story on its own. So I was kind of working with two different things there and had to make them mush together. So you need to make sure you have information that the players will care about. It's important, as well as the puzzle stuff. And then also, I don't entirely know what I meant with this one. Reading versus visual versus spatial investigation. Right, you need to think about how much the player will be reading, how much they'll be looking at stuff, and how much they'll be investigating a space or like looking at an object in 3D, right? Or like trying to open an object if it's like a puzzle box or something. So those are things you need to consider about, like, will the player be doing these things? Why won't they be doing these things? Which of these things will actually help them gather what they need? So figuring out, budgeting and constraints also helps with this one. And then how to create the hook, the rising tension, the emotional climax, and then the resolution. Because you need these things for an actual compelling story. Like, formulas aside, because storytelling formulas can be good or bad depending on what you're doing, these things are relatively important for telling an emotionally resonant story. And I believe that's important. So this is some of I had a big ass notebook. I write in paper when I'm designing, not on screen because it's way easier. So this is basically the list that I'd created for the tutorial, I think. The tutorial, it wasn't quite a tutorial. Oh, I can see it there. Yes, tutorial-ish segment. Probably can't read my writing because I write very small and very messy. But basically, I wrote down the ideas for the assets that I wanted to have in progression because the tutorial was going to be linear and then the rest of it was going to be non-linear. And so I wrote down the assets that I wanted, and then I wrote down what they would do for like the emotional side of it, and then what they would do for the puzzle side of it. So what information would the player glean? So for the tutorial, core character names, that was something that we needed for the puzzle. The player character's full name and date of birth was something we wanted filled in for the puzzle. So it's basically, I'll give you a quick rundown. So Shoebox was basically, you had a whole bunch of assets, mementos, and you'd basically solve a family tree, and you build a family tree while also getting the story of the family. And so the idea for the tutorial was to get the player character, her brother, and her dad's like full profiles filled out. And then from there it would lead to the gaps that would lead you forward. So you'd have the player character's full name and date of birth, you would have the family and relationships, and then a very small emotional arc, a very, very tiny one that would be the hook for the game. And also, an intro to the mystery. This was something I struggled with a lot, because we were trying to make a positive game, which is really hard when you're trying to make a mystery. Mysteries don't work well on positive emotions, which is really hard to do. I'm still struggling with that for something else I'm writing at the moment. So these are the paper assets I made, basically. I realized that would be a lot easier to do what I was doing. This is extremely early prototype stuff for the record, for the tutorial in the first box. So forgive it for being very unpolished and basic. Building these assets of paper prototypes gave me the ability to really feel out how information could and could not realistically be presented. And it helped me figure out where emotional beats should be constructed, right? So I would group up certain things that you get in a certain order, and see like how they would make the player feel. Like, would these be good or bad? I don't have the picture because I left my notebook at home and had to get my flatmate to take photos of me. God bless my flatmate. But there is a picture I missed, which was me basically drawing out the emotional arcs that came with each, like the emotional beats that came with each of the assets and where they should be to make a person feel too good. And at one point I realized I had too many negative things right in the middle, and I needed to bring it up a little bit just so I could bring it back down. Like, bring it up a bit, make you feel good, and then really just tear that back down, instead of just making you feel low all the time. And at some point I also had too many positive emotions, and I was like, nobody, like, it's good to feel positive all the time, but like, you need variation in a story, right? Like, you need to go down a bit so that the ups feel good. And so I had to use as much of the asset as possible to communicate information. These things were designed to be poured over. Not these ones in particular, but the actual assets were designed to be poured over, like really just looked at. If these were only going to be made to be seen once, so like in a room that you pass through once or something, they would have less subtlety and nuance and would emphasize the necessary information as opposed to like these, which have the information kind of spread out amongst the thing. Because you can use the texture and the colors and whatever. So if it was different, if I was using it for like something like inside, right? If I was designing an asset for inside, there would be bigger gaps in what it means, but it would be a bigger bit as well. So like a bigger bit of information for you to latch onto, but you still have massive gaps in between that information. Oh yeah, I wrote this thing. So I basically have, hang on, where's the airline ticket? Where is it? Okay, so do you see up by that red thing that says it's meant to be pink, right? Like kind of in the middle? The one that's an airline ticket for air whatever. And there's also one down here, which is air whatever. But see how that one's not torn, right? So that's the minor story arc I had there was for the main box. And this character was scared of flying because her mother died her mother and father both died in a plane crash, right? She's scared of flying. And she was going to go to China with her family, but she chickened out and she didn't go. And so you find in the box this thing and you get other information that tells you can infer that she ended up not going on the plane when her brothers did. And then up higher, much later in her life, you see that she has a ticket there and that she actually went on that flight. She finally worked up the courage and went and visited family. And so that was a minor emotional arc I had in there. And obviously when I explain it like that, it doesn't mean anything. You're not like feeling the heartstrings pulling. And it wasn't meant to be an important part of the thing either. It was just a small thing. Like, so information ticket, like a ticket gave me information like your full name, right? So that's how that worked as well, is that having that ticket gave me a full name, but also her going to Brisbane was important for another thing in the story. So I was using puzzle information there, but also I use it as an opportunity to give a bit of character growth and a bit more character depth, when otherwise there may not have been any. So that was my thought process there. So this here is a thing I made when I was trying to figure out basically where the gaps were in my story and the balancing of story and puzzle info. So I think the green means it's story-related info, and blue means it's puzzle-related info. And you can see that some of them have both. So some of them are related to both. And basically, I was balancing out which asset was mostly story and which one was mostly puzzle to make sure that I was balancing it, that the players weren't just getting puzzle stuff. But I also pointed out where each one led. So like what you could infer from each thing to lead to another one. And I was making sure that you had enough information from each asset that like if you missed something on one asset, you'd still be able to find it on another one, right? So there wasn't just one track, except for photo of new house, which wasn't actually that important. It was just the resolution, basically, which is why there's only one track leading to it, because you don't need to infer that very much. And it also had like, yeah, so you can see there it's built into like 3 kind of chunks. And so the first chunk is the tutorial. The second chunk there was like the first half of the box. And then the last one was going to be the last half of the box. And at the time we were kind of thinking of separating them up in envelopes or something so that there was a little bit of a breaking up the information. Basically, this was the best way for me to figure out where the gaps were and where information needed to be changed. And also where there was too much information. And it's actually worked really well. It seems like a weird way to go about it, but like strangely useful. You never know. This is why I like using paper. I also have a whole bunch of writing here. Gameplay info, story info, links to info bits, ease of access. Yeah, the ease of access for your player because that's important. The information flow, that's also important. Necessary gaps. There we go. Here's the tutorial. There's some of the art. The amazing Blake Wood did this. He's very good. So basically, these are only some of the tutorial photos, pictures. So basically, I'm going to briefly explain this to you. So the tutorial started with a photo of the main character, which you can see on the side there, right? Which was sent from her dad or something. It said, I love how you look in this photo. There's more to it, but it's down low because obviously they're 3D assets. So basically it starts with a photo of the main character, so you understand what she looks like. It would move into her passport as a child, so you get her main, like, her date of birth, all the stuff. You also get, like, kind of a throwback to how she looked when she was a kid. Like, remember, this was, like, the first draft tutorial, so, like, it's not perfect by any means. And then it moves to a photo, which you can see there, of the mother with her little brother, whose name is spelt wrong in that picture, because my bad handwriting, I think, threw that off. Born the same year as me. So basically that is the introduction of the little brother. You get his full name and his date of birth on that, right? So it was story and also info. And then from there you moved into the first day of school, which is that one, the one with the two little kids looking very cute. It's the little brother's first day of school. And so that's how you get that they're siblings, right? So the one with the baby photo doesn't actually say they're related. And the next one is them being related, right? That's how you get that information, but also gives you that growth of them as characters. From there was a photo of the two parents together at Brisbane, which is linked to the plane ticket later on. That's not here because that didn't get finished, I don't think. So it shows their parents, like it gives you a parental relationship. But you still don't see the family together yet. And then you get your dad's license, right? Which is there. It's an old license, so he's got an old school hairstyle, I love it. Which gives you his full name and date of birth. And also it comes with a little note being like, hey sweetie, blah, blah, blah. So it gives you an idea of their relationship between him and the main character. And then you get the family photo, finally, because this is linear, like I said. So you pull it out. It's a family photo, it's very lovely. And because you've learned to flip them over, you flip it over. And it's a funeral service announcement, well, not announcement, funeral service booklet thingy that you get for her mother, who has died. So basically there's meaning in the gaps, right? So you get all the other core family members' birth dates, right? You get all their birth dates and their full names. But, so, they're the only ones that have those things filled in. The mother only has a death date. She doesn't have a birth date. And so you're left with this empty gap of when she was born, whereas everyone else has that full. But nobody else has a death date, obviously, because they're all still alive. And so that's a gap that's supposed to be, like, significant in some way. And actually, like, I think when people actually played through the paper prototype, they're like, Seth, what the fuck? Why would you do this? Because, like I said, I needed an emotional hook of some kind, and this was how I was potentially going to do it. Does that all make sense to you all? Okay, glad to see heads nodding. So there we go into, so we're moving away from shoebox a little bit here. Or maybe not, I don't know, there's still some shoebox stuff in the notes. So basically, we've developed pattern recognition for survival, right? We need that, that's a psychological thing we've learned. And we have storytelling for assessing, that's a better word, assessing our place in the world, like our actual, giving ourselves narrative, and continuing generational memories. That's how we've kept a lot of history before we had, you know, the internet and writing and stuff like that, was actual storytelling. These are things that we've evolved over a long time. They're things we just do automatically. We don't realize we're telling stories, but we're always telling stories. So we can't help but create stories. That's why I just said, good work me. We can't help but see patterns. It just happens, right? You like see a couple things and you're just like, oh, I see a pattern there, and it just happens automatically. You can't. It's really annoying sometimes, but it happens. And this is why we can stretch gaps, right? Because we automatically move to fill in those gaps. Unless they're like ridiculously wide and completely not connected, our brains are like, yes, I can build something here. So like shoebox were designed for the fun of organizing and sorting information, which comes with this. A lot of the actual narrative games, archival, not actual. Okay, so I made up a term called archival narrative games, which is basically Her Story, Gone Home, Papers, Please, games that involve looking through information, sorting it to solve a narrative, right? And so Shoebox was going to fit into that kind of area. And so that's where a lot of actual narrative games are compelling, in the information sorting and the organizing of data, basically, in our brains. We want to find the patterns and uncover the stories. And largely we enjoy setting things in order. There's like a good feeling about putting things in the right order, right? It's just something, I mean, unless you're a super chaotic person, and I am, but I still enjoy putting things in order. Pattern recognition is why games like this work. But how far can we stretch gaps, right? Like, at what point do info bits no longer connect? Causal relationships. I realized after making this slide that it's actually causal relations. And it's not casual relationships. We're not talking about those today. So, back to inference, which I mentioned before. 4 criteria for inferring causal relations. This is a thing from psychology. I forgot the name of the guy. It's in my sources. I read a lot about this. This is a thing that comes back a lot. This is why maybe there's no psychology people here, because I probably got it wrong a little bit. But anyways, So we have, I went too far, temporal priority. So the cause causes the consequence, right? The cause happens and the consequence happens. Trust me, this seems like really basic stuff, but it actually is not as basic as you think once you get into stuff. I remember when I was reading this paper and I was like, this is really obvious, duh. And I read further down, I was like, oh, that's why they made that clear at the start. So I went back and highlighted it all. So it is actually less basic than it looks to begin with. Anyways, we want to get this properly nailed down. And these are all given the circumstances of the story itself. So like, it's within your mental model of the story. So, right, obviously, cause, then consequence. Consequence doesn't happen before the cause, because that's dumb. Operativity, which is a great word, which is the cause is active during the consequence, right? The consequence doesn't happen like, this is particularly important for games, is the cause doesn't happen, the player forgets about it, and the consequence happens way later, right? That's not a thing that works. You don't connect those two bits. That's where a coherence break happens, and there's no inference happening there. So that's an important thing to remember, especially in games. If your consequence seems unrelated, okay, I'll finish this actually first. Circumstantial necessity. No cause equals no consequence. A consequence does not happen without cause, right? I mean, in the real world it might, but when you want inference, it can't. Where did I go? Yes. And then we have circumstantial sufficiency. A cause occurs, a circumstance will likely... A circumstance? That's the wrong word. A consequence will likely occur, obviously. So, yeah, if a cause occurs, the consequence will likely occur. So there can be forward inference there, depending on... There's a lot of writing about forward inferences, and a lot of this is related to just reading, but it works for other stuff as well, right? And games often have a lot of writing anyways. Like, this does work for other kinds of media. And so if you have... the example I read in one of the papers is a woman, like, a guy yells at a woman, a waitress, and then she holds a plate of spaghetti above his head, right? And from that, you probably gather that she's going to tip the spaghetti on his head, right? That's a consequence that you jump to. Or like someone jumps out a window on a top-story floor. In your head, you're like, okay, he probably falls down and dies. These are coherence breaks, right? They're not coherence breaks, there's something else. But basically, this is the only time that forward inference happens, is if a cause that has a consequence like highlighted or obvious, I guess, that's when you will have forward inference, which I don't know how useful that is for a lot of people, but it's a thing to remember. And so if you don't have any of these things and you put a consequence to an action way later in the game, the player's not going to infer any information there. They're not going to make that connection. These are important criteria to actually remember. So I want to make a note that temporal priority does not mean you can't have nonlinear bits. So you can present nonlinear information to a player. It's only that in the story's true chronological time, the event must precede the consequence. So in the actual timeline of your game, the event must be beforehand. But the information that the player sees doesn't necessarily need to be. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. Otherwise, the inference won't occur because it just straight up doesn't make sense, and you want to make sense. Also, in terms of time, the further two connected bits are from each other for the player progressing through the story without reminders, the less automatic the inference will be and the harder the recall, right? So you can have two bits far away from each other, but you probably want to have reminders to reactivate that for the player. So, inference, more inference. Events and bits with more causal, I knew that would happen, causal connections will be more likely to be recalled, obviously. Bits that do not occur as part of the chain of events that lead to the story resolution will also be of lower recall priority. So basically, if you have your whole story, like the chain of events that create your story, right? And you've got a bunch of other little bits that come off, that tell other bits of story. Those little extra bits are less likely to be remembered by your player, unless they have some kind of own story resolution happening. Basically bits that lead into dead ends for the player are way less likely to be recalled. So keep that in mind if you want your player to remember some random bit of info somewhere. Unless you give them an actual proper reason to, they probably won't. Yeah, connect your bits in ways that players will recognize, especially if they can't go back to see or interact with them later. You definitely want them to remember that stuff if they can't. But also, good thing to remember, people will go out of their way to connect disjointed bits. Just look at theories for literally any ongoing theories. Look at Star Wars. So just add one link, at least one link, to the core narrative chain if you want it to be remembered. So what about the other side? What about having too much space? Wait, yes. How far can you stretch gaps? That was the opposite of what I wanted. Yeah, how far can you stretch gaps? It's a good question. There's no real science here. Nobody's really figured that out yet, especially not in games because I haven't found any info on that. I could be wrong. Like I said, I couldn't find it. But the more unrelated info you give the player, so like the less gaps you have, but the more unrelated info, the further down you push important information in their memory, right? So if you keep overloading them with heaps of info, they're gonna struggle with that. And it's a lot harder to like mess up gaps, I guess. So basically, temporal priority is likely to be the most important of the criteria. So temporal priority is good to remember when it comes to automatic inference. And I just said, just remember that, okay? That's my note for that. A good rule of thumb is that if you need a player to remember something, tell it to them 3 times in different ways. So repeat it 3 times, and that will help them remember, if it's something really important. Another way to help players remember an info bit is to give your players a choice related to that bit. So whether it's narrative or mechanical, whether irrelevant or extremely important to the narrative, an interactive choice of some kind helps embed the information. So remember that. Choice, even if your game isn't a choice-based game, can still be implemented in other ways. And that's not what this talk is about. I could go into that, but I'm not going to. So, wait. Yes. Here we go. Repeat important bits. Design causal links. Remember that. So what if we have too much info? The other side. Because gaps are flexible, but bits can overwhelm. We don't store info gaps in our memory like we do info bits. We have to remember information. We don't have to remember an absence of information, right? So info dumps can be hard to remember. Here we go. They're extremely hard to remember. So if you played Skyrim, how much can you actually tell me about the lore of that game from just playing it once, right? Like, everyone you talk to just throws all this information at you. You're not going to remember all of that. Especially because the game itself, I think I talk about this later on in the talk, the game itself is not built towards learning that information. So rare events found amongst a metaphorical desert of information can be incredibly powerful as opposed to a lot of information happening at once. So say you've played Journey, right? And that game is quite a dearth of information, but every now and then you see something interesting, and that really stands out to you because you don't see that much happening. It's better to err on the side of less information than more in designing environments and narratives, unless you're relying on your players to deduce facts to continue the game. If you're relying on players to get certain things, you definitely want to make sure that you make that a bit more obvious. Kind of like in cinema and books, your audience is a little bit dumber than you're ever going to expect. You need to design for the more general audience. Unless you hate money, I guess. Which you know what, some of us do, so go for it. But yeah, if you want people to actually know information, remember to remind them of it, repeat it a couple times, that's important. That's why my previous thing of the circles, I had the important bits of info had multiple things pointing at them from other things, so there were lots of ways of inference there, because that was important. So, more about too much info. Hang on, I really need to okay. So, reading on screen is harder. This is going to be talking about reading a little bit, so bear with. Reading on screen is harder on comprehension, and breaking interactive flow in a game is jarring and can cause impatience. So if you have a game that has a lot of action and suddenly there's no action whatsoever, your players real into it, and then they just have to push the button a bunch of times to click through writing, or they just have to sit back and read a cutscene or watch a cutscene. You need to consider the impatience happening there and the play breakage, basically. Screens remove the ability to create a mental model of the text. They kind of inhibit that as more than paper reading does, because you can't place yourself... Where did I put it? Yes, okay. Losing the ability to visualize a mental model of the story and the info given by text, our reading comprehension, and changes how we store information. That was bad. Anyways, this is more relevant the more text you have in-game, obviously, and especially the more text you have on screen at any given time. Studies have suggested that information learned via physical reading, paper, is remembered and known, so actually known, which is feeling something that is true without remembering the learning of it, whereas information learned via screen reading is more likely to be just remembered, which is a weaker kind of recall and is more likely to fade. So, important to remember, if your player just reads information on a screen, because they can't place themselves in the context of the entire story and whatever, it's a lot harder for them to remember it. So if you expect them to just remember something read in your game, they probably won't, unless you give them some gameplay reason to, or bring it up multiple times, a lot of characters say it, and then that's an oral thing, right? Because they're saying it out loud. So that's important to remember. feel like there was something else there that I was supposed to say. This is probably it. Anyways, this is why digital writing has paragraph breaks when paper text needs only line breaks, right? When you're reading an article in newspaper, there's no big gaps between the text. But if you're reading it online, there's paragraph breaks because you need to be able to orient yourself in a chunk of text, or else it's a lot harder to read it because your concentration, if you look away for a second and go back, you can't orient yourself back where you were. Whereas if you're reading on paper, you have the entire context in your hands. The entire thing is in your hands. And this is a psychological thing. And also because it's an actual physical shape, you can be like, oh yeah, I was here in the book, and point at it. But if you scroll a little bit too far, you're like, oh, I've completely lost my place on a screen. And like, no shade on e-readers or anything, because I have a Kindle, I love it. Just give me a second. Ugh, disgusting. No shade on e-readers or anything, because I have a Kindle and I love it, but it does make it harder for your players if you intend on them reading stuff. So, of course, this is like something that your UI and UX designer will be thinking about. But also, if you're designing it as a narrative person or a writer or level designer or whatever, you should, well, maybe not level designer unless you're designing levels with text. But narrative designers design for the player, right? Writers should be writing for the player. These are things we need to consider. And designing for bigger gaps can be good because of it. So the more text on screen, this is another issue. The smaller the screen as well, the smaller the in-game text will be. And this is not great for multiple reasons, not just for comprehension and ease of play, but also accessibility, which is also another important thing. There's a lot of good stuff about text accessibility that you should look up if you plan on having a lot of text in your game. Bless you. So yeah, it's not just for players remembering things, it's also useful for just general audiences. Next, ambiguity. Whoa! See, I promise we get back to this. So vagueness. Emergent narrative. I never thought I'd be talking about emergent narrative, but here we go. Ooh, I need to finish. Okay. Emergent narrative relies on info gaps and the ambiguity they provide. Yeah? We need the ambiguity. The ambiguity gives the player space for imagination to take hold and to recognize patterns where they may not exist. Actively designing gaps for the ambiguity aids player agency and personal story creation. So personal story creation is the player's interior model of your narrative, where their actions have influenced the narrative events, whether or not they actually have. It also allows them to fill gaps to create stories set in the world that you may never have considered. If you just like chuck some bones in a yo-yo in a forest, they'll make up a story for you. It's totally free. You'll find 3 chapters worth on fanfiction.net. To quote my incredibly smart and great mentor, Alexander Horn, in order for something to emerge as greater than the sum of its parts, there needs to be space for something to emerge into. So, bad gaps. Real bad gaps. Ambiguity can go too far, obviously. Gaps can go wrong when they leave players with little to no closure or meaningful resolution. I'm sure we can all think of games that have given us that. I'm not going to name or shame any, but we can think of them. Another issue in gaps is allowing inference of a different story, which gives your players different expectations for your narrative, which can end in them feeling like, lied to or frustrated by your game. We don't want that. The other side of ambiguity is too much authorial voice. I'm a big proponent for tailored narratives. Like, I love tailored narratives, but this can go too far. If your voice overrides the player's experience, then you need to take a step back. Tailor your use of gaps, ambiguity, and info delivery to your specific game and to the experience you want your player to have. There's no rule that fits every game. Playtest your narratives. Do it! Even if you have to build them in paper. Playtest your narratives and the way your players receive important information in any way you can. Use whatever you can, because you need to know how anyone but you, the person with the story in their head who knows everything, you need to know how literally anybody but you infers that information, right? You need to know other people can understand your story, either with a large amount of information or a small amount of information. It's important to understand that. If your players can't understand your necessary info, fill in your gaps a little. Players are overwhelmed, trying to use too much unrelated info to understand your game. Time to consider where gaps may help. What was that final thing I wrote there? There's no one-size-fits-all gap. Yeah. I mean, gaps can fit any size, but you know what I mean. Anyways, thank you so much to GCAP for having me, and also to Film Victoria for sponsoring this talk. I am very thankful for that. Also, thank you to Dino Polo Club for letting me talk about the Sherlock stuff, because I've been wanting to talk about that for a while. I've been researching this stuff for over a year, as I said before, and I think it's a very useful part of narrative design. So, there we go. These are my sources of stuff. I have a lot, obviously. The Van Den Broek guy, I don't know how to say that, has a lot of good stuff. I'll let you take photos very briefly. There's another page of sources. Here it is. You can tell I didn't animate that one. Nope, there it is. I did animate it. There we go. I have more stuff. If you want more info on this stuff, just ask, because I have a lot of PDFs. And I have referenced a lot more than this, but I don't have my notebooks, so I can't source it. Any questions? If I haven't talked too much time, do we have time for questions? Absolutely. Okay, cool. We have time for questions. Thank God. So you can ask them now. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Whoa! I was so worried I was going to go over time. You can find me on Twitter as well, at Wanderluster, or email me at sethdavidson.com. I am very open to talking about narrative and stuff like that. Or you can just find me wandering around. I'll be around for once in my life. That's it. That's it. Any questions? Or you can clap. Whatever. Yay! All right. Any questions at all? Oh, wait, there's one down the back.
Any tips for making procedural generation for story content feel a little bit more organic and natural?
Oh, I haven't done much work on procedural content, so I can't help you too much there. I would say playtesting it would help a bit. Knowing like where it doesn't feel natural and being able to like slot in stuff there would definitely help. That's the only advice I can give there, because I haven't done too much procedural stuff. Were you?
Yeah, I was just wondering, can we have your slides, please?
Oh yeah, I can post them on Twitter.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah, I can totally post them on Twitter, and the notes will probably be included then if I do that. Yes?
Just probably get this question a lot, but what if you were to get into writing and into games, what are the kind of things that you would need to do, like portfolio-wise, getting work or contacts to make? Like, what do you think to get yourself out there?
So I came into games from not being involved in games at all. I didn't even finish a degree related to games. I didn't even finish a degree. Basically, just write interactive fiction. So learn like tools like Twine or Inkle. Is it Inkle? Yeah, Inkle. The other ones, here are other ones. Twine is a very good one to learn because everyone uses Twine. And it's also very easily, like, it's very flexible. So you can do a lot of stuff with it. Twine is how I wrote my first game and how I got jobs. So definitely use Twine, build a portfolio through that. I would suggest there's a lot of good, like, if you're interested in narrative design at all, I would read the Narrative Designer's Toolbox or whatever it's called. It's a very good book. Helps you like learn how to write for a game from a very basic level. That book kind of propelled me very much into stuff like that. Yeah, and then like I would just suggest like reading a lot of stuff about game stories, writing down the stuff you find interesting. Also playing games that you love for stories, and breaking down why you love them and what they do that's good is a really good way to like kind of learn that info. And also then to try and recreate that feeling through interactive fiction is another way to learn how that works. And yeah, just chilling people. Okay, I got 5 minutes. Any more questions? You again.
Well, what is the difference, I guess, between you had your lunchbox, whatever it was?
Oh, shoebox, yeah.
So in a specific order, and it might have potentially not been in a specific order. Is there a difference in crafting gaps when you know what order things are going to be presented in versus not?
Yes, absolutely. If you know what order things are going to be in, you can definitely be more sure that a player will learn information later on. So if you have a very linear game, your gaps can be a lot bigger in certain places because it's a linear game. So the player will automatically connect the sequence of events happening. Whereas in Shoebox, the reason we like kind of ended up deciding to possibly, none of this prototype got like pushed back and a different prototype happened. So this is like really old stuff. The reason we decided to possibly break the Shoebox into 2 different envelopes was because we realized that just giving them all the info at once was an overwhelming information basically, but also overwhelming gaps in that information to begin with. And so if you're doing it in a non-linear way, you need to consider how much info and how much like, amongst the tidal wave of info, how many gaps are like there happening that are gonna overwhelm the player. So yeah. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
I guess if I can follow up with one more question.
Yep.
Do you try and like, where you might often have a salient beat in someone's mind, do you often like have a time when you want the player to be thinking about a certain gap? Is that?
Yeah, so in Shoebox I had one thing, so like you learn through the box that the mother has like 2 brothers, right? And they're twins. And then you like learn all about this family and everything, and then one of the photos in there is this twin with like, one of the twins with like this family that you've never seen these people before. And that was a designed gap to be like, who are these people? And that would then lead into the next box, which was about him. And then through that there were also gaps about the player character's grandmother, who was the main mystery of the story. And so there'd be actively designed gaps there, so the players would be like, what is up with this person that has no face and no name? So yeah, definitely designing gaps to like drive player curiosity is a very important thing, especially in mystery. Okay, any more? Yes?
Do you have any pet peeves in narrative games?
Whew. My main pet peeve is just giving the players a lot to read without consideration. I understand that, like, especially in RPGs, like, you want to write, like, a tabletop, and, like, you want people to love your good writing. I really like, okay, Dragon Age Origins has a lot of reading, but I really like how they place the lore elsewhere. So you can go find the lore if you want, and it's really well-written lore. Like, I love the lore of Dragon Age. But they don't force it in your face. Like, whenever you talk to someone, they're not like, here's all this lore. You can ask them specific questions, and I appreciate that. My pet peeve is, yeah, when you talk to someone, they just, for some reason, give you, like, a 5-minute rant about whatever it is. Or if you start playing a game, and they're obviously really excited about their setting in their world, but come back, computer. I think my computer might have died. That's fine. Oh, no, it's alive. It's fine. So, like, yeah, they're obviously excited about the story they want to tell, but then they throw you in, and all that you get is just a bunch of text. Like, I really hate that, because you're just overwhelmed with all this stuff. And, like, you know, like, the jokes of, like, fantasy writing, and it's like, you read a blurb for a story, and it's a bunch of weird names and stuff that you don't care about. Even sci-fi, they've made up a whole bunch of words, and you don't care about that stuff. It's just meaningless to you. Games can do a similar thing. So what you need to do is, like, bring the player in slowly, introduce them to it, bring in the gaps to begin with, and then fill them in. Don't, like, give them an overload of information, because that's too much information. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, hello, yes.
You've spoken about limitations of text in games. Do you have any suggestions about other methods of communicating, such as audio?
So audio can definitely get overwhelming or frustrating. A lot of people will also turn off their audio sometimes, because, you know, it's too loud, or they want to listen to other things. Like, I turned off audio for a lot of games, just listen to music while I play them, unless they've got particularly good voice acting. So yeah, like, relying on, you shouldn't rely on any one format of giving information to a player, obviously, because they may not be paying attention to that, or they may not care about it. But yeah, basically don't overwhelm people. When it comes to audio, you don't want a lot of loud sound happening unless there's, like, a reason for it. 1 minute. Visually, you don't want to overwhelm them with, like, heaps of colors and stuff. Like, artists know their shit with that. So do audio designers. I can't speak to that stuff as much. But yeah, no, you definitely do need to be careful with how you present information, because if you have, like, a really stimulating visual environment, right? Like in BioShock Infinite or whatever, and you've got, like, an audio tape playing, but, like, you really want to look around, like, look at things, but you've got the audio tape playing, and so you just kind of have to stand there and listen to it playing, and then it finishes, and you're like, okay, cool, now I can go pay attention to everything else. You overwhelming player with lots of, like, information from different levels is also just, yeah, not a good idea. All right. Is that it? Yes, thank you. If you have any more questions, like I said, I'm on Twitter and email, so.